Kia ora, welcome everybody to the Te Puna Aonui Evidence to Practice session. Nice to see you all here today. I'm going to start us off this morning with a karakia to bring the positive energies from all directions into our hui today. Tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa mai I raro, tūtawa mai I roto, tūtawa mai I waho, kia tau ai te mauritu, te mauri ora, kia katoa, haumie, huie, taikie. Thanks everyone for joining us. Ko Cheryl Han, toku ingoa he paki aho. I'm with the Te Puna Aonui Business Unit and I'm your facilitator for today. Before we get started with this fantastic session, I just wanted to give you a couple of messages. In this version of Teams that we're using today, you can only see the presenters. You can't turn your camera on or speak, but you can ask questions. So use that Q&A function that's at the top to put in your questions for the researchers, and there'll be an opportunity to have those answered later on in this session. We are, and also please, you can't screenshot or independently stream this, but we are recording the event so you can have a look at that online soon. In today's session, we're pleased to welcome Kiri Matiatos and Nicola Atwell, who are both part of the Mortality Review Committee, some of that is formerly known as the Family Violence Death Review Committee, for those of you who knew that. They're going to be presenting for about around 15 minutes on the evidence that they have gathered related to stalking that come from the intimate partner violence and child abuse and neglect homicides that were reviewed by the committee between 2020 and 2024. And the questions that you put in the chat, they'll be asked by the National System Practice Lead, Mary Beresford-Jones, who's from the Te Puna Aonui Business Unit. So she's going to come on in about 15 minutes and ask those questions. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can. So just a reminder to you, we want this to be a safe and inclusive space. These sessions are going to cover topics of sexual violence and family violence that may be difficult or distressing. So please do what you need to do to look after yourself and to get the support if you need it. We're going to post the links to help portals that are available in the chat. And that's where you can talk to someone on the phone or on online chat or find out more about the services that are in your area. So now I'd like to introduce Kiri and Nicola. Kiri is the Principal Advisor for the Family Violence Mortality Review at Te Tāhū Hauora, the Health, Quality and Safety Commission. She supports the family violence subject matter experts who are leading those in-depth reviews of the death events, and she coordinates the work program. She's previously worked in the health sector for about 20 years as a nurse and a nurse educator in acute care and family violence settings. And Dr. Nicola Atwell is the chair of the Family Violence Subject Matter Expert Group that are conducting those specialist mortality reviews and producing reports and publications for the National Mortality Review Committee. Nicola's worked as a social work practitioner and academic for nearly 50 years and was recently at the University of Otago before she retired. Doesn't sound like a retirement though, because she's currently independent contractor providing supervision and training and consultation. So I'm going to hand over to you, Kiri and Nicola. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Kia ora, Cheryl. Thank you so much. And kia ora koutou. I know I can't see you all, but I can see the numbers of you there. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you about this important topic. I think Nicola maybe will come on to introduce herself before the Q&A. Is that maybe how we're going to do it, I think? And I'll carry on. I'm going to do the presentation first of all. So as Cheryl said, we're just going to share a presentation with you, which is a pretty brief overview. 15 minutes is not too long, just to give you a summary of some of the key themes that came out of our review that we did into our stalking related data, and then hopefully address some of the questions that come out of that afterwards. Just before I start, I just did want to reiterate what Cheryl's kindly put out for us today, is that we do work in the family violence death review space. So the examples that we'll be sharing with you for the purposes of today are unfortunately all narratives and themes that come from actual family violence homicides. So this is events that have occurred leading up to a homicide, so can potentially be distressing for some of you listening in. So just to reiterate what Cheryl said, please do take care and take note of the links that she's posting if that's of use to you. Yeah, I think you've introduced me as much as I need to be introduced, and we'll see Nicola's face later for the Q&A. So I'm ready for the presentation to go up. Thanks, Andy. So just for to make it clear, I guess, what the information that we are covering, as Cheryl said, does come from the in-depth reviews or any death reviews of child abuse and neglect and intimate partner violence deaths that were reviewed during the period from the start of 2020 through to June of this year. And I guess I just want to say a limitation of that is to acknowledge that we know in many circumstances, as with family violence and sexual violence in general, stalking is not always reported, and as a result is often not captured and recorded in agency documentation. So where that hasn't occurred, we haven't been able to speak to that space. So we're largely looking at cases where there has been a police recorded evidence of some stalking behaviours and pattern of harm that we have included in this sort of summary that we're putting before you today. But it is certainly an undercount and really just looking at some of those key themes and to encourage us all to look and consider stalking more widely. Thanks, Andy. So just a little bit of background to kind of why we're here today and where this has all come from. As many of you will hopefully know, there has been a drive to get stalking made a separate offence in New Zealand legislation, which it currently isn't, although there's some cover under some of the other legislation that's related. And we were dealing with some Ministry of Justice colleagues around how our findings could help to inform the design process for this new legislation. So we put together a paper initially just for the Ministry of Justice around some key themes that came out of the cases we've identified and really framing up some, I guess, some thought-provoking and challenging questions for MOJ in terms of what that might mean in the legislation design. We also shared that with some of our key stakeholders, one of whom came back to us asking if that could be shared for a teaching tool, obviously around stalking and things to be mindful of. And we were like, yes, this is a great opportunity to hopefully share our findings and learnings and provoke some wider thinking around this area, but it was really geared up specifically for an MOJ purpose. So we've made another iteration, and that paper for the more general kind of public and the wider sector has just finally been published on our website yesterday. And I think we'll be able to pop that link to that in the chat for you as well today. So you can go and have a little bit more detailed read about what we've covered. So basically, we're liaising with Te Tāhū Hauora around this work and were asked to come and present. And here we are to give you a little overview. So thanks, Cheryl, for the invitation. And thanks, Andy. Next slide. So basically, as I said, we'll just really talk to the 5 key themes that jumped out from the data that we had to look at. And for each of those themes, we'll go through them and I'll provide a little bit of narrative from some case information. And we've pulled out just a selected one of the reflective questions that we've formulated to try and help stimulate, I guess, the practice setting in the wider sector around some things that we'd like hopefully people to be thinking about and how we might maybe look at things differently. So I will try, and where it's not obvious, I'll just try and give a very brief overview of what the homicide situation was. Certainly not a whole lot of details, but just who has died and who's been the offender, so it helps to give a little context. But these are the themes that jumped out from the data that we reviewed in terms of non-compliance with protection orders and or bail conditions. It was quite a strong feature. Use of children as a form of stalking and control. And this might be something that perhaps is not traditionally viewed as stalking, but what became really evident in the stories that we looked over was how stalking and stalking behaviours and the multitude of stalking behaviours are essentially an extension of those coercive controlling behaviours to instill fear in people. So there's a lot of crossover with that. Yeah, and use of multiple forms. So not just perhaps what we more think of the stereotypical, perhaps, stalking behaviour where someone is physically following, watching, etc. But all of the other things that can involve, such as the use of children, unwanted gifts, ongoing harassment, damage to personal property, etc. And inadequate responses to people seeking help, which unfortunately is not is a common finding that we've found across many of our in-depth reviews over time. We know that people experiencing family violence, sexual violence, and stalking is no different, are proactive help seekers in many different ways. And unfortunately, oftentimes that help seeking is met with an inadequate response or a response that really puts a lot more onus on the person seeking help, or also increases risk and potential for harm. So a lot of work to be done in that respect. And the other theme is around the importance of taking threats to kill seriously. So yeah, I'm going to just go through each of those with a brief example. And obviously this is, I feel some ways it's not doing justice to the cases that we're talking about. However, it's just an overview to get the conversation started, so it's hopefully of some value. Thanks, Andy. So the first case example is looking at non-compliance with court orders. So it could be either protection orders or bail conditions, or oftentimes it was actually a combination of both. So the case I've used here is referring to Fraser and Meyer. And unfortunately, Fraser ended up taking Meyer's life before he then took his own. And there were obviously children involved in this scenario as well, who are still surviving. So Fraser was prosecuted previously for a serious assault on Meyer and had bail conditions not to associate with her, but he continued to breach those. So they had separated, were living in separate dwellings. He frequently turned up at the new home despite the conditions in place, saying that he just wanted to see the children. During the visits, he was quite a volatile man and had some very violent behaviours that he continued to use, not just towards Meyer, but children and other extended family and associates as well. And he continued to harass her, physically and emotionally abuse her during these visits. And he was known to have said that he would do whatever it took to see his children, and he had absolutely no intention of ever complying with any police or court orders. And I think, unfortunately, this is a pretty common kind of scenario where we think that there's safety measures in place, that these sort of court-enforced orders should be of some protection, and actually, in Maya's case, did very little to protect her, and she was getting support to go down a protection order route as well, which she was quite nervous about initially, as it was, you know, her partner and the father of her children, and didn't want to create risk of further backlash, etc. as well. So I think it just raises a lot of questions around, I guess, are these orders fit for purpose and victim and whānau focused as best they can be in the first place, but also what options are actually available for victims when offenders continue to breach these orders, particularly in the process of stalking or that ongoing control of victims. So I guess it's a cry for organisations and agencies alike to think, how can we perhaps pivot in our traditional responses to things like this to actually ensure that the measures we've got in place are increasing safety and decreasing risk for our victims. Thanks, Andy. The second theme that we talked about was, as I mentioned, the use of children as a form of stalking and control. And this one here, as I said, it might be a little bit of out of left field in terms of what people typically think around in relation to stalking. But again, it's that real extension of control and manipulation, and reminding the victim that actually they're always there, they're always involved. And I think having children adds that added layer of that continued connection to an offender. So the case that we're talking about here, unfortunately, was, so Lucy is the mum and Dan was the father of the child, Katie, and they had a very brief relationship when Katie didn't want to continue the relationship, but Dan continued to wish that there was something more. However, they were separated and living apart, and Lucy had gone away for a few days, and when she returned to pick Katie up after having left him in Dan's care, and doing much beforehand to ensure actually that it was safe, he was safe to provide all of her routine cares that she needed. Dan refused to return Katie to Lucy's care, and he refused her entry to the house. He refused any further attempts to gain access to Katie, and basically was met with a response from him indicating that he'd see her in court. And he also threatened that, well, he said, you can have access to Katie, but only if you give me full custody. So there was this manipulation going on at the same time. So this, Lucy obviously sought help for this because she was really concerned. There were some drug issues in the background. She had other concerns for Katie's safety, which were vocalised. Police were involved. She was really advised to get a lawyer because this was seen as a custody issue, which she did get. But unfortunately, when things were waiting to go before the court, Dan actually fatally assaulted the little girl, Katie. So, yeah, really devastating. And I think there's a number of things that sit within each of these cases and a lot of overlap with them, but I think really important reminder that it is not just the perceived primary victim who's actually at risk of harm, significant harm and death from situations of stalking and, coercive control. And also, I think a really, really important reminder that we need to be really mindful to not focus on individual episodes or incidents of things. We need to be able to look at that pattern of behaviour, and actually, someone could say, well, Dan was wanting to be involved. He was wanting to see his children and be involved in her life. That's fatherly, how nice, and he wants custody for whatever reason. But actually looking at that pattern of behaviour over time tells a really different story, and really important reminder for us to always focus on actually the impact of that cumulative pattern of harm on the victim and the levels of distress and re-traumatisation that they deal with. So I guess an individual behaviour might be considered benign, and at that cumulative pattern, it can, in this situation, really undermine someone's parenting ability, and at the same time really placing increased risk around the children involved. So I'm thinking about how can we actually consider this a form of stalking or an extension of that control, and also in terms of the prosecution, are there any uses for current legislation as it stands that we could use, and actually how that might be impacted by the new legislation that hopefully will be more bespoke around stalking. Thanks, Andy. Use of multiple forms of stalking behaviour was very common across all of the cases. And I think it kind of alludes to, or again, I guess just reiterates the importance of not just looking at isolated events. We're looking at a whole pattern of behaviour. So the case in question here, unfortunately, is another homicide event where Stan and Tracy were together for a number of years but had separated, and Stan ended up fatally assaulting Tracy. So it was noted over many years that by friends and family that Stan seemed to stalk Tracy. He'd often listen in on her phone conversations. She would spot him when she was out and about, like separately from him, and she'd sometimes see him following her in the car, although he always said this was just a coincidence. He would often turn up at Tracy's work unannounced, and for various things demanding she pay for things that he'd bought, etc. And her colleagues noticed a real change in her demeanour whenever he turned up, and he would always get a beautiful bunch of flowers delivered to Tracy's work after he turned up there unannounced. Another time, after a heated argument, Tracy had stayed at a friend's house, and they'd gone into work together. When they came back to her house after work, they'd noticed a front window of the house had been smashed, and Tracy's car door that was parked outside was wide open, and there had been quite a bit of willful damage done. So I guess this case kind of highlights, one, that there's concerns by friends and family throughout a relationship. Also the different forms that one person can actually inflict upon somebody else, and the fear she had for him, and basically everything that she did, he was everywhere. Friends had to leave the home to have a conversation with her. And, things like flowers, sending it to work, again, looking at those individual behaviours could be seen completely differently in addition to that pattern of harm that Tracy was experiencing for many years from Stan. So I think, again, just reminding us to look more widely. What is our understanding of stalking and patterns of behaviours? What might those behaviours look like? How is it impacting the victim? And how can we better respond? I think this is really important, and I'm reiterating it, I know. How can we better respond to the overall pattern of behaviour rather than those isolated events to try and intervene and enhance safety? Thanks, Andy. So just 2 more to go. So I think this is around inadequate responses to people seeking help. And as I mentioned, it's a common feature of many of our in-depth family violence death reviews. And some of you may be familiar with the death of Fazana Yakubi a couple of years ago in a stalking context when she was actively trying to seek help herself. And there is a bit of crossover with this case in terms of some police involvement as well. So this case was an intimate partner violence related homicide where so Saffron was married to I'm just trying to find here the husband's name. The husband's name was, Neil, sorry, it's right in the first line. So Saffron and Neil were married but had separated after a serious assault against Saffron by Neil. And after they separated, there was some protection order in place, and in time, Saffron got into a relationship with Neil, and unfortunately with Alex, and Neil, the ex-husband, unfortunately ended up taking the life of Alex, the new partner of Saffron. So there was a course of events that happened in this case, and on a particular occasion when Alex came to the police station, and they managed to identify that Neil, the ex-partner, was the respondent of a protection order relating to Saffron in this situation. And police response was they've asked that Saffron come in the following day to help to formalise the complaint. They acknowledged there was evidence of breach of protection orders and the bail conditions by continuing to contact. Saffron wasn't with Alex at this time, so it was said, look, we need her to come in and we need her to formally do this at the station. Alex had said to police at the time he thought that he was safe and he was more concerned for Saffron's safety. And they talked about a trespass order, but the police officer didn't think serving one would be a good idea at the time due to a potential confrontation from Neil, which indicates they were concerned about risk in this situation. They did enter a file in their system following Alex's complaint, but unfortunately they didn't link Neil to this file because they deemed there was insufficient evidence for this, unfortunately. And I think we can see some of the issues just in this little snippet, looking at there was obviously some risk identified by police and not wanting to create a potential confrontation. They wanted to follow up about the protection order, but they haven't linked the files, which is going to be a big gap in, linking their communication together for any future episodes. And I think a part of this that comes out too is not only is this an ineffective response in terms of enhancing safety and decreasing risk, but we're really putting additional burden of response on the individual or the family or whānau. So we've got Alex at the station already reporting these concerns, and we've got police responses partly involving we need to get the other party to come in the next day to actually make additional steps to try and enhance your safety. So I guess, and I think that's a really big thing to be mindful of, that we've got people who are coming to ask for help. And at that point of having to ask for formal help from our services, from our agencies and organisations, that already indicates that they have got dwindling resources, whether it be emotionally, physically, financially, etc. So asking them to do more is problematic. Thanks, Andy. So last slide here is around the importance of threats to kill that have been made in these situations. And this situation involved Justin and Jenny, who were partners and had separated a time before the homicide event. And Justin had continually made threats around how he was going to kill Jenny and kill himself. And unfortunately, the homicide event did actually mirror exactly the threats that he had made to numerous people. So he had told a family member, he believed that Jenny was having an affair, and he told a family member that if she was, he would kill her and then he'd shoot himself. not long before the fatal shooting took place, Justin and a friend were on a little road trip together, and he mentioned to his friend, FUCK, I'd like to blow her away, in reference to Jenny. Jenny's mum, Naomi, was also aware of Justin's threats to kill, and then to kill himself specifically. She was really concerned by that, but she felt quite unsure about talking to police and didn't want to bother people in case it was just hollow threats that he was making. The added complication was that their family was really averse to going to police for anything when they needed help, because there were other, behaviours in history with that family that just made that something that they didn't feel comfortable doing. So yeah, quite a distressing case where actually those threats weren't hollow threats and were followed through with, and there were numerous people in the sort of extended whānau and friend group who are actually aware of these and concerned. So I think it raises the really important questions. One, it raises the really important point that we have to take these threats seriously. And secondly, how can we encourage family whānau individuals to actually be better supported to consider that they're reporting threats to kill to the relevant, social services or authorities? And I guess as well as that, how do we take those seriously and act accordingly? That's a bit of a grim note to end the presentation on, but that's just a really brief summary of the 5 themes that kind of came out for us. And the next slide, I think Andy just basically says for partai or questions. So I guess at this time we can bring in Nicola and Mary.
Kia ora, kōroa. Ko Mary Beresford-Jones tōku ingoa. I just want to thank you so much. Your presentation was so interesting and it's such important information. As Cheryl said earlier, it's my role to facilitate this part of the hui, and we'll go to some questions now. But I just wanted to remind people, Andy and Cheryl have posted in the chat different phone numbers and links people can reach out to if they need help or if they have questions about responses. So I just really encourage people to reach out if they need to. Welcome, Nicola. Did you want to introduce yourself? Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, ko Nicola Atwell tōku ingoa, and Cheryl described me perfectly well in the beginning, so
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kia ora. Okay, I'll go straight into some questions. The first one I'll read out: are the insights into stalking patterns reflected in validated measures of intimate partner violence risk? If not, how do we weight this information in risk assessments? Is it just down to opinion based on analysis of the individual offender's behaviour?
I think the key is to be not conducting risk assessments on an incident basis. The key is to be considering overall patterns of behaviour. Risk is only ever a snapshot in the moment, and I think if we rely too heavily on standardised risk assessments, we miss really important information that helps us to understand how dynamic the situation is and have an understanding of risk that is based on really considering all factors and re-evaluating over time, because often these are there are sequential events that are responded to as isolated incidents, and so it's always being mindful of the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think too, I sort of feel like a risk assessment can be a great tool for starting a conversation, but really important, like Nicola says, that we acknowledge it's not the be all and end all. And I think the question was specifically around IPV risk assessment as well. And I think hopefully we've highlighted with some of the themes today that actually it's bigger than just that, not just, but that victim of IPV, it's children, it's wider whānau, it's new partners, etc. So I think we just need to be really careful. And I think absolutely what Nicola says, looking at that pattern of harm rather than trying to focus on a sort of more tick box and incident-based approach.
Kia ora, thank you. Are there other good practice examples from overseas you could share with us?
I'm not aware of any that are specific to this topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of specific practice examples, perhaps not, but I do know that there's been, I guess, more forward legislative changes that are occurring, like we know in the UK and Australia, etc. So I guess that's a part of what then has a ripple down effect to practice, to hopefully enable people to acknowledge, hey, this is actually an offence, so let's take it seriously, let's be asking around it, you know, responding more appropriately. But yeah, in terms of specific practice examples, no, sorry.
Cool, thank you. Do you have any advice on what we can do to improve the practice of professionals like judges and the police in their understanding of stalking and coercive control?
It's always difficult making sure that people bring have a comprehensive grasp of those concepts. The legislation, the family violence legislation, I think sets out fairly clearly the ways in which family harm can manifest. It very much also identifies, if we're talking about patterns of behaviour, we liaise with justice around judges have a thing called the bench book, which supports them in their decision making. So it's just looking for those opportunities to have influence where we can. But it's also, I think, about keeping those conversations going, particularly at the community level within our multi-agency forums, and making sure that we're challenging what may be narrow preconceptions around what may be happening.
Kia ora. Thank you. Did you have anything to add to that, Kiri, or shall I move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think it would really be reiterating what Nicola's saying. I do know that there's some really good work. We work quite closely with certain arms of the police in terms of, you know, ongoing work to exactly, you know, how we can better respond and improve knowledge and responses around all of these things, you know, like those patterns of harm, etc., that we've already talked about. I think, you know, things like the collaborative approach of Te Tāhū, etc., is another great forum that we can use to try and bring those things together. And hopefully, I mean, I can't say what the legislation is going to look like at this stage. We've just had some, you know, a contribution to potentially the design of that. And I guess that will be something that the police, for example, will be hopefully have some education geared up around how that then works into practice. But yeah, we are, in terms of our family violence subject matter expert group does, as Nicola said, have a link into the judges bench book, particularly in the family violence space. So that's a really great opportunity to, you know, to push back on things, to challenge, to help widen that gaze on things, to how we can kind of, do better in this space and consider those things.
Kia ora, thank you. I was just saw a question that's come up, which sort of links into some of the things we've already talked about, but I thought it could be worth just reading out. It's just asking if there's any work being undertaken to set some key indicators, assessment tools across agencies to consider risk, probably post initial assessment, which would strengthen the overall collaboration, risk understanding in the family violence space. A shared risk assessment tool across spaces would be really useful, especially if it contributed to cross FV agencies, even if it was embedded in the family safety system. And that's an interesting question, isn't it? So it's asking around that consistency across how we analyse and manage risk.
You can talk to that pretty well, Mary.
Well, I was about to say, is there things in that research that could give us some really good information to strengthen that work that's being done at the moment in the risk, safety and wellbeing space?
I think there is a danger in relying too heavily on tools. Risk is dynamic. It's ever changing. And I think that we can get a false sense of security from conducting a risk assessment. We keep looking for consistency. Actually, every case is unique. When we do the death reviews, with the wisdom of hindsight, you can see the patterns that led up. But there could have been exactly those same patterns in another family where a homicide didn't occur. So I think we have to be really aware that this is dynamic, that we can't put hard and fast kind of categorizations that tell us what to do next, that it is very much about keeping collaborative conversations alive, particularly in multi-agency forums, so that relevant information is reaching the people who need to know, and we are responding to that in a timely fashion rather than relying too heavily on predetermined criteria that make us can create an illusion of safety, which is not real.
Kia ora.
Yeah, absolutely support that, Nicola. And I think I'd add too, like in terms of in the practice setting, I understand, people want a tool, they want something that's going to help them, they want to be able to understand that sort of the context. And I think a really, really important part of that we can't stress enough is actually listening to the people that are telling you they need some help, listening to the victim or victims, listening to the whānau or family members when they're saying to you, hey, this threat to kill has been made. We are really concerned. We're really concerned this is a pattern of behaviour. I'm really distressed by this pattern of harm that has got a cumulative effect on me. Those examples we talked about, there was clear evidence that more than one person knew about things, more than one person was concerned about what was going on. And that's not just organisations and agencies, that's family, that's friends, that's work colleagues. So how can we listen better? And how can we respond accordingly that actually values that and holds that at the forefront of our responses, rather than, we can't actually predict with any definitive measure a homicide if it's going to occur or not. Yes, there are things that might make us more concerned, but it's really important to listen to the voice of the individual and whānau.
Kia ora. Yes, thank you. That's great. There's another question around how should we be responding to children's experiences of stalking. So I know you showed that slide and talked a bit about how they get drawn in to support the person's use of stalking. Do you have any recommendations around how we can be responding to children or supporting children in those spaces?
I think we need a much better understanding of the range of behaviours that can be utilised to exert control. In particular, if children are directly voicing concern, we absolutely need to be listening to that and responding to that. But we have a family court system that essentially encourages ongoing contact with both parents, and that's not a problem in itself, but it can lead to behaviours that are actually threatening being seen to be within the normal range of a father wanting contact with his children. And I think we have to be a whole lot better about hearing, coming back to Kiri's point, listening to people, listening to the impact that the behaviours are having, and finding ways to address matters. I think there is a place for some very robust conversations with parents in these conflicted situations, to ensure that they are actually putting their children first and are not using their children as weapons in ongoing battles. And this is an area that I currently have a high level of concern that we're not grappling with adequately, and that there is a bit of a tendency to take sides, to not listen to the children, or not create the safe places for children to talk about their experience of these things. That if we interview them with a parent present, they're going to feel very loyal to that. If they're caught in the crossfire, children become very adept at trying to keep everybody happy. And we're not doing a good job of finding ways to create safe space for children to really talk about their experiences in some of these situations.
Yeah, and I think too, just being mindful of those younger children, like in the example we use, when they're non-verbal and they can't be telling us, you know, what might be going on. So how can we keep keeping our eyes wide open in terms of our approach? And particularly, I think that comes to mind is like through the court processes and associated kind of systems, how, you know, that can get turned around, and we've got that vexatious litigation, and we've got the mum who's you know, being gaslit and controlled and further traumatized through that process by that controlling partner, and it's deemed as, like in this case, a custody issue, when it was actually ran a lot deeper than that. So yeah, I agree with what Nicola said. I think there's a bit of work to be done in that space, and definitely comes back to widening our gaze, just keeping an open mind, and not just, you know, going down that maybe obvious path.
There's been a few questions come through that have similar themes in terms of a lot of what we do currently is reactive rather than preventative. And I just wondered if, I know you mentioned earlier on about a teaching tool, but I was just thinking about those things that could be in that prevention or early intervention phase. Like, what would you recommend for creating awareness about what stalking is and what signs to look out for, so that people do catch it earlier?
Yeah, unfortunately, we still have a system that is resource intensive at that reactive and almost crisis point. To build a peaceful Aotearoa, we are really going to have to get serious about prevention and early intervention. I think education programs in schools are really critical, particularly helping young women to identify behaviours that may not be safe, or that, you know, show signs of coercive control, so they've got the language to understand and be able to articulate concerns. I think we need to be doing a whole lot more in terms of a family court system that is oriented towards helping people navigate those conflict pathways in ways that very much keep the children to the fore. I think that's an important preventive element. But yeah, we've got a lot of work to do in that space. And you know, and again, I also think not minimizing when something's perceived to be low risk. Actually, that might be your best opportunity to do an early intervention. And so that's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of risk assessment, because often low risk means no action.
No help.
And that means they keep representing until they're high risk, and by then it may be too late. So I think we need to be thinking about setting our systems to support people at the earliest opportunity. And I'm not talking about kind of punitive reactive responses. I'm looking at support for both perpetrators and for people who are being subject to harm.
Yeah, 100%. I was just going to bring that up, so I'm glad you did too, Nicola. That's, I think really important. We definitely see that in terms of our, family violence death review data, in terms of doesn't meet the threshold for intervention. So you know, we'd love to reframe that. Everybody who's seeking help, whether it be something seemingly minor, we want to intervene at the earliest given opportunity. And that all, as Nicola said, just feeds into that whole prevention model. Yeah, which is, with agree, going back to those comments about risk assessment, you can see the danger in that. Yeah.
Kia ora. I just feel like I want to ask you a million questions. I feel like I could stay on here all day. I'm mindful time is ticking along. So I wanted to just check if there were any last or really key messages you wanted to drive home before we bring Cheryl back in.
Yeah, I think for me it is paying attention to patterns and also looking for the earliest opportunity to support people, whoever they may be, in the family harm spectrum.
Yeah, and I second that. And I think just that reminder about paying heed to the voices of our victims, and I mean that in a broader sense, the children, the wider whānau, family, friends, anyone who's expressing those concerns, we need to listen and really try and understand that from the victim perspective rather than that kind of thresholding risk, I guess, and really widen our gaze and remembering about that pattern of behaviour and harm as opposed to our isolated events. Yeah.
I guess the one other thing that I would emphasize is that we need to be listening and really understanding the impact of some of these behaviours on people with trauma histories, because what might seem minor or trivial to us could be enough to spiral someone right into their trauma response. And so we need to recognise that the experience of trauma is inherently subjective, and we shouldn't be passing so-called objective judgments of whether something is serious or not. If it's having an impact, we need to be paying attention to that, and not being judgmental in any way. Being open to supporting and hearing from that person's perspective, given their background. So I think that's the other thing. This is very subjective. It's easy to minimise or see something as minor when in fact it may be having a very profound effect, which is immobilising, and that reduces the person's ability to be self-protective.
Kia ora. Thank you both so much, and I'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for having us.
And I'll bring Cheryl in. Kia ora.
She's microphoned.
You're on mute, Cheryl.
Thank you so much. I was busy answering questions. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Kiri and Nicola. That was a lot packed into a really short session, and there are so many questions that people have been asking. We haven't been able to get through them all. I just wanted to acknowledge the people that have been asking questions about getting help for themselves or for other people. It's really great that you're reaching out for help. Please ring one of the phone lines, talk to some of the local services, talk to victim support. If you find the first people you ask for help aren't very helpful or don't give you the help you need, just keep on going until you find the right place to get the help that you need. You can call the family violence phone lines, even if you think what's happening to you is not family violence. They'll still give you some advice about where to go and what services can support you. So please do that. I think for all the people online who are working in policy and practice at the front line, you've just given us so much to think about. And so much that we need to follow up with and work that we need to do. So thank you very much. Reminder for those of you who want to join us next month, we've got another session on the Evidence to Practice series, and this one's going to be about calling men into a journey of change. It's about the research that's been informing the Campaign for Action on Family Violence, about their work with men through the Changes Possible and the In Your Hands website. So look out for that invite. It will be coming out soon, and the information will be on the Family Violence Clearinghouse as well. Now I'm going to close, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the presenters. I'll close with a karakia to clear the pathway towards a safe and productive day for all of you. Ka whakaeria te tapu, ka wātia ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai, haumie huie tāike. Thank you, everyone. Go well and safely for the rest of your day.